I'm sure your day was filled with the Ryzen 5 benchmarks, so how about a change of pace for the end of today? I built a custom loop inside the NZXT S340 Elite. And yes, it was as hard as it sounds. There were a few compromises I had to make right off the bat, the most obvious of those being the pump mounted on top of the basement rather than inside the basement where it typically goes. Most of the time you don't want to show off the pump. It's just not a very aesthetically pleasing feature of a custom loop, but being that the S340 Elite's a rather stubborn, non-modular case in that sense, I can't just remove the hard drive tray underneath. It's actually bolted to the basement. I'd have to drill through it if I wanted to remove it, which I wasn't willing to do because I don't want to mess up this case and I've never done that before. I just decided to put it on top of the basement. It actually fits perfectly in the SSD tray on top. It's like it was designed for that. So I did my best to make it look like it was a part of the aesthetic side of the custom loop, even though obviously if I could do it all over again, I would try to find another way to hide that underneath. There just wasn't much space between the power supply, the Be Quiet 1000 watt power supply I've got underneath, and the hard drive tray. There just wasn't enough room for a pump down there. Now the other compromise, you know what, let's not even say compromise. Let's say unorthodox methodology. I had to wrap the 24 pin around the cable shroud of the S340 Elite, which is definitely weird. Most people just kind of stuff it underneath the original opening on the left side, closer to the motherboard, but I wanted to show off these cables. I didn't want them all cramped up, and that's one of the issues I had with the S340 Elite that I explained in this video right here. But Tony made these cables, the 24 pin, the 8 pin, as well as the 8 pin EPS up top, which you can't really see, but it's still nice to know that it's there. He has a third-party vendor that he'd be happy to share with you. You can follow him on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. He's got all the same social media accounts that I do. And he also has a YouTube account, which I encourage you to subscribe to. It's linked in the video description. But he makes all this stuff by hand. He was more than happy to help me out here. I really do appreciate it. I think it makes the build pop. It wouldn't look the same without them. The red and white accents of the cables definitely match the case as well as the red fluid, which is where we'll go next. I chose red fluid. I used the C1000 Pure Clear, which is Thermaltake's C1000 Opaque clear counterpart. Remember, I had issues with the opaque coolant before, but I decided to go with the clear stuff this time. Haven't had a problem yet. I also used the Thermaltake red dye, and I'm still doing just fine. So we'll see how that goes. Pretty much everything in here that pertains to the custom loop, by the way, is sponsored by Thermaltake. I actually recycled much of this from the Ryzen custom loop build, which you can check out right here. But the specs of this build are linked in the video description. i7 6700K, just a GTX 1070 for now, although I will be doing something very special with a 1080 Ti here soon. But I just wanted another challenge. I was frankly challenged by Ed from Techsource, who felt like talking a little smack about my original Blue Sky build, also didn't find my Ryzen custom loop build too enticing, although, I mean, I built two in the same time that it took him to build, well, a fourth of one. And so I decided to slap him in the face with this third custom loop build, which took me only a day and a half to put together. I didn't film the build process because I wanted to focus solely on the custom loop. There were a few bends in here that were very tricky. You're looking at this bend right here, from the GPU to the CPU, completely unnecessary, but what I call the fuck you bend. That's for you, Ed from Techsource. And this other bend right here, it's kind of like a corkscrew that goes up from the CPU to the 120 rad mounted in the back. I think both of these bends were just necessary for the build to look excellent, for the build to look different and not just, I don't know, ordinary. And of course, from the 120, the loop flows into the top-mounted reservoir, which I will admit I was a little uneasy about. That's a lot of weight, a lot of fluid up top that's only being suspended by a couple of pipes, and it's also slightly hanging on to the top of the 240 rad in the front of the case. It is fairly stable. It will wiggle back and forth if you really force it, but as long as your fittings are secured properly, you shouldn't have any leaks. Now, by this point, you might be wondering why on earth my front-mounted rad is upside down. Typically, the pipes funnel in from the top, right? Well, in this case, because the reservoir is where it is on the top of the case, there was no other way to make this work. So I had to have the pipe from the reservoir feed down into the intake at the bottom where the rad is turned upside down, and then have that fluid feed into the pump on top of the basement. Typically, you want your reservoir to feed your pump directly. That way, when you cycle through and get that fluid moving, you don't have air that's trapped somewhere. Usually it's trapped at the bottom, or if you can't get your fluid down from the reservoir initially, you can't really cycle your fluid because you have no fluid there. And you don't want to turn on your pump when there is no fluid there. The pump will just spin way faster than it should, heat up, usually kill the pump after a few minutes or so. So don't do that. Make sure that you rotate the case a few times, especially in a scenario like this where the reservoir is not feeding the pump directly. So that was another compromise I had to make. I didn't mention that earlier, but I figured by this point we're talking about the custom loop. You can kind of see why I did that. And from the pump, a couple of 90-degree fittings lead directly into the GTX 1070, and this is a Thermaltake GTX 1070 1080 reference PCB block. I did have to remove the Thermaltake backplate though and fit the AlphaCool one, which is also a bit weird because these are competing manufacturers when it comes to custom cooling gear. Nonetheless, it wouldn't fit the Thermaltake one with the ASRock Supercarrier Z270 motherboard, which I'm using in the build. You can check out that review right here. But the rear IO shield is just a little too thick, and I couldn't fit that backplate underneath that IO shield, the Thermaltake one. So I swapped it for the AlphaCool one, which is very thin at the rear where that IO shield is, and I think it looks okay. You can't really tell that it's a Thermaltake block anyway, unless you look at it from the bottom, and even then it kind of looks like a lot of other blocks out there. If you're wondering what kind of RAM I have in the build, this is Galac's Hall of Fame DDR4 clocked at 3000 megahertz. It's difficult to get your hands on, I will admit, but if you can, do it, because these DIMMs look spectacular. I've had them for a few months now. I've actually used them in a very old build, which I don't blame you for not knowing about, but I think in this case it looks great with the white case as well as the white accents in the cables. I stuck a couple of Silent Wings 3 fans from Be Quiet at the front in front of the 240 rad, and a single LED white deep cool, I don't know what it's called specifically, but it's a fluid bearing fan from the Gamerstorm series. It's what you would get if you bought a 240 or 120mm Captain EX. So that's where I took that fan from, if you're wondering. A few people have asked about that in previous builds, but that is what that is. It's not as quiet as the Silent Wings 3 fans in the front, not anywhere near as quiet, but with a few tweaks to your fan curve and your BIOS, you should be okay. Now the icing on the cake in my book for this build is the PNY Accelerate SSD. This is a 960GB SSD. It's the only drive in the system, of course, with my operating system on it. All of my games that I benchmark with, as well as Adobe Premiere and my footage, it's plenty. 1 terabyte is plenty for all that I personally do, and the red and the dark kind of gray black accents really do match everything else in the build very well, especially the motherboard and the red accents in the cables along with the red fluid. So that's it. This is my 3rd build ever. Let me know what you think about the bends in particular, what you would do differently if you could build this. I understand everyone has different preferences. You know, this is my PC, so I built it the way that I want, but if you could build your own PC and had the same parts, what would you do differently? Let me know. If you were interested in maybe some kind of experiment where we drill through the case and try to mount the pump underneath the basement and get rid of that hard drive tray, which I'm not using, by the way, I recommend that. We could probably get that done, I would say, within the next few weeks or so. So we might reconstruct this loop if we can fit the pump underneath. That's the only thing I would personally change about it. It just takes a lot of work. You got to drill through, and it's a good case the way it is, and I don't think it looks that bad. If you like the video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, thumbs down for the opposite. Click a subscribe button if you haven't already. I will catch you in the next video. Finals week is coming up. I'm going to be very busy with stuff other than YouTube, so be patient with me. This is Salazar Studio. Thanks for learning with us.